Now here's my big slide. Of course, I don't have a great picture. It's just a spy here, but this is a slide that you'll want to pay special attention to if you are considering moving some portion of your software or even your hosting or infrastructure to the cloud. This is, again, just working in this industry for years, this is the information that I think every organization should be asking, and a lot of them don't. So this is one that if you're going to take notes now. Okay, so the first section here is if you're considering business software in the cloud, like the ERP or CRM. You might work through a VAR like Crestwood to license the software, but underneath the covers, the vendor, the actual publisher of the software, is going to have an end-user license agreement, or a EULA. That EULA will stipulate warranties, will stipulate liability, will stipulate a lot of different things about the software that you're going to be using and accessing. So if you don't get a copy of the EULA and you sign up, shame on you. So ask for it. You can get copies of it, run it through your legal department, make sure everything checks out. Not all EULAs are the same. So that's one course of due diligence you can take as a professional for your organization to make sure you're partnering with the right cloud software provider. Another point that folks don't think about is how easy is it to get my data out of this software? And we've seen this with some of our competitors, unfortunately. They make it so easy to transition into their product. You can migrate your chart of accounts, your customers, your vendors, your historic financials, your inventory items, and boy, they've got the easiest template. But getting your data out is not an easy thing, and that's by design. It's like when you go into a casino, not that I've ever been in one, you can't find the exits, and all the bells and whistles are going off, and you've spent your life savings before you know it. Well, it's a similar kind of approach. They don't want to make it easy for you to leave. So, research that. Not that you're intending to sign up to leave, but long term, you might be a growing organization and you might outgrow that solution functionally, and you'll need a way to transition into a more robust functional system. Also, is your instance in the cloud dedicated to you? And the dedicated is a twofold component. Is the application dedicated to you? Is the database dedicated to you? Or is it more multi-tenancy, as I mentioned? And that analogy of an apartment building is a great one. If you want to paint, if you live in an apartment building with 50 other tenants and you want to paint the common area, like the hallway, purple, well, you're affecting everybody else. So the cloud publishers restrict you from doing those kinds of things in a multi-tenant environment. So you're going to want to find out, am I going to need some customization here? Will this publisher or vendor restrict me from building an integration a certain way? Or giving me access to a database a certain way. So, make sure you research that and understand your business and your requirements before signing a contract. The next point is on licensing, and this really does relate more to, the billing and the licensing, not so much the deployment model, but what will your price be year over year? And this is another one in the industry that, people kind of, unfortunately, they don't sign longer-term contracts, and not all publishers will do it. We work with Microsoft, and they're more reliable. You can kind of see that their pricing is pretty consistent. But there are others out there who aren't that way. So if a publisher, you feel unsure or unsafe with them because you feel, yeah, they might discount that first year to get me in the door, but year two, it goes up by 120%. That's a pretty scary thing because now you're beholden and your data's in their system. So ask for multi-year pricing or contracts. That's another thing you can try and do as you're considering a software. Also, too, support is a big one. You'll see that support, you might think, oh, it's in the cloud, the publisher is going to support it for me, but that's not always the case. So if you're trying to do an apples-to-apples comparison as you're looking at software, ask about support because that's another factor and cost component that will go into the software. Now, the second bit here is more for businesses who are looking at hosting their existing application or an application in a cloud that would be less like SaaS and less multi-tenant and more for like a hosting provider. So these are questions you could ask a hosting provider. Ask for their SLA, their service level agreement. That is essentially, it's what details out how often they'll be up, and it's a guarantee generally. So they might say we're up 99.9% of the time or 99.99% of the time. And that SLA will kind of outline how often they're going to be up, and they'll even offer you back credit if they don't meet that SLA. So look at the credits, look at how it's refunded to you. And again, you kind of get a better understanding for the quality of the hosting provider as you start to research SLAs and how often they think they'll be up. Another thing that folks don't think about are these hops. So if you're hopping, and a hop is really as you're moving from your workstation to wherever that environment is hosted, there's lines you're covering, actual physical lines that you're taking to get to that database. So that's the number of hops, and the more hops, the worse response time you're going to get. So we like to say, like as an industry standard, you want 7 or less hops, and there's free tools you can use to go out and run if you're like evaluating a hosting provider. Some of them will, like single hop here in Chicago is very good. That's one of their kind of claims to fame, that they do a better job at getting you to the environment. But that's another thing you can kind of research and understand before you sign up, because that will affect your performance as you're interacting from the workstation to the database. Some providers will offer these nodes, which is almost like an accelerated way to get to the, for lack of a better term, to the data center. So the more nodes, the better, and that will also kind of impact your performance. So that's a little bit more on the infrastructure side. But if you think of latency, I was thinking of an analogy. If you're in like a NASCAR racetrack, but you're driving a Prius, as good as your hops are, as good as the infrastructure that exists that the provider is offering, your car is only going to go as fast as the horsepower. So latency is another one that will affect the performance, and that there's other factors in latency, distance, and the speed of your internet connection and the bandwidth that is provided. But that's another component to consider, especially if you have multiple locations. And by the way, if you do have multiple locations and you're going to have users in those locations, make sure you're running these tests in terms of like the hops test from every location to make sure you're going to have acceptable performance. Backups. Certainly that's an additional cost in some cases for if your ERP is basically hosted in the cloud infrastructure. So you're going to want to make sure the backups are either covered or what that additional charge might be. If you want to bring a backup, maybe more back to your on-premise world after, at the end of the day, you'll want to just consider that plan for getting your data back. And certainly then geo-redundancy. And this is, I guess probably something people more commonly think of, but make sure your hosting provider has redundancies in multiple grids. So if there's a natural disaster, your data is being backed up and you're not going to have any sort of lost time. It'll cut over for you. Even if a data center is not hit by a hurricane, but they're doing routine maintenance, you're going to want to make sure there's a plan, not only in a separate grid, but maybe even in a separate continent, to make sure you're not going to lose any kind of uptime from your system's performance perspective. So that's a little bit of a summary on what they don't tell you.